Hey everybody, I'm Noel, doing synergetics and nuclear structure again. After I discovered what I discovered, I began reading about nuclear physics, lots of articles and books. In 2013, I read in August the Scientific American where Stephen Hawking wrote an article. And you know, he's a really smart guy, we all know that, but after I was reading his article, I thought, what a retard. I mean, some of the things he was saying are just so stupid, at least compared to where I was coming from. And I was continuing to read these other physicists and stuff. I was thinking, boy, you guys really have some stupid ideas, and you believe in some stupid things that don't make any sense, and you're trying to create mathematical models in order to prove these illogical things. Stephen Hawking, for instance, he thinks that viruses are not alive. He thinks that, or he mocks people who believe that the human has a biological energy field. And I can only ask, does anybody know about an electroencephalograph machine or electrocardiograph, which take readings of the electrical impulses in the brain and the heart? Ever heard of an MRI machine, magnetic resonance imagery? That's where we use frequency in order to read the frequencies from the different organs which resonate at different frequencies from one another. It's very powerful, the biological energy. He also said that, if a fish were in a round bowl and a fish could create mathematical models, it would be able to create a model of the universe which suggested that all the humans that were walking in a straight line outside, and which seemed to be walking in a curve because it's in a curved bowl with water in it, and with the way that light diffracts. He says, if a fish could make a model, he could prove that all those people outside were actually walking in a curve. Just because you can create a mathematical model that proves one relative viewpoint compared to another, which means you're creating a mathematical model by changing your reference point to inside water, calculating the density of water, the density of glass, the alterations of the light pattern going through it. You of course could do something like that. Create a mathematical model that proved to you that all the things that were walking on the outside were walking in curves, even though us walking on the outside knew that we're walking in a straight line. So enough of that. Is it easier to believe in multiple universes and multiple dimensions crushed down into one? Or is it easier to believe then that we've been misled by great minds who are not thinking clearly? Is it easier to understand that at the very, very, very smallest micro levels that we cannot perceive, maybe even we can't even perceive them with our best microscopes and electron microscopes and all those types of things? Can we imagine then, along with string theory, that these energetic vibrations called vectors can self-stabilize themselves into intertriangulated patterns in order to create polyhedral structures of greater and greater frequency or density? And is it easier to understand me if you've been following along as I've created these vector formulas which explain the total number of energy vectors or forces which are existing in these polyhedrons at these extremely dense levels, and how these vector formulas create field equations which unify the energy and force field dynamics, which string theory, quantum mechanics, quantum electrodynamics, electromagnetism, particle physics, and relativity are all only hunting in the dark, grasping at finding pieces of the puzzle to. I'm explaining the whole puzzle. Folks, I love you. The reason I'm doing this is because I was like, oh my God, mankind is being so led astray by their minds. Your minds need to come in tune. Stephen said things like, I don't exactly say how he put it, but he made it seem as though war was inevitable when he was making his conclusions about how, we just can't make a model which will graph all these interior things happening in the nucleus of the atom. We're making up these funny little things called gluons. I think we got some glue gluing this piece to this other piece. I think that's how it's happening. No, watch my videos. You'll understand. It's easy to understand. I explain the strong force and gravity, etc. If you're just tuning in, you'll have to watch my other videos, but just real briefly, the total number of energetic vectorial interconnections that self-stabilized polyhedrons of different shapes, are calculated. And their total number of vectors then, when broken up, which come as a full family of vectors, acting as a full family of forces, which when broken up in the Large Hadron Collider, create certain number patterns, ratios between the electron, the proton, the neutron, Planck's constant, and the fine structure constant. And these 5 constant ratios all show up as whole rational units within my vector totals. The amplitude at which an electron absorbs a photon shows up. The fine structure constant shows up. The mass of the deuteron shows up. The ratio between the proton and the neutron shows up and explains definitively why. Its ratio is 0.000545 compared to one another, and we don't have to multiply that by 2.5 to make up the lost mass. We don't have to make up extra dimensions. We don't have to make up positrons, and I don't care if we've got Nobel Prizes in the past for finding photons, Einstein, and positrons, forget his name. It only matters that we start to dispel the illusion which our mind is created by the model we use with cubes and the way that our mind thinks with what a dimension is. See, I don't use the word dimension other than in my last video to explain string theory's idea of dimension. See, dimension's not a noun. Dimension's a verb, or can be used as a verb, and dimension can be used as an adverb. So dimension is the word that means a noun, but it doesn't exist. Things are always changing and moving in the universe. We used to think that a first powering, like 2, like the edge length, was a first dimension. We used to think that 2 times 2, the area of a square, was the second dimension. And then we thought that the third dimension was a 2 times 2 times 2, a volume, giving us this volume space that we move around. There's nothing wrong with this way of thinking, but we must understand that words cause conditioned associations and mechanical reactions that keep our minds locked into specific realities. And these reality tunnels will only be changed when we change the words we use in order to more clearly explain the experiences we're having. Check and make sure we're still running. Good. So I only use the word dimension in accord with like adverbs, like dimensioning proclivities or the tendencies of energy vectors to dimension themselves. I don't believe in multiple dimensions where, ooh, maybe extraterrestrials live in these extra dimensions or spirits live in them. No, sir. That's not what's happening. We're making up words because we can't understand how these energy vectors at the minutest level of composition and of universal affairs are building themselves up in frequency interference patterning to such high densities that we're finding them then in these ratios. Remember the ratios we're finding? I'm not going to go over all of them again, you guys. Finding the deuteron, go over them real quick, right? We got, this breaks up in the masses of the proton. This mass breaks up into the neutron. Watch my other videos, please. As I'm mentioning. In whole rational units, we're finding all kinds of things like the deuteron, right? We're finding 4 protons and 4 neutrons ratioing each other. 1836 by 1838.5, only by taking 1 electron or 1 unit, 1 sphere out of the center, remember? So taking that 1 out is changing it by 2.5. We don't need to make up that extra 1.5 with positron and neutrinos. Here we're ratioing then the total number of vectors right on our scale, and ratio them in accord with the electron's AMU. And then I only went over briefly, and I don't think I explained real clearly what I was trying to explain. I got this cool little model here. I think my batteries are running low, so I'm checking it intermittently. So, try and perceive then in our mathematical schema the vector equilibrium and its 6 axes. Hope you can see okay. You got this board is this plane right here. See these 6 vectors? Those are 3 of the axes. The other axes are coming out. See, coming out here and then going back behind the board. Imagine, if you will, then, see this plane here? So you have, for instance, a plane coming out this way, a plane coming out this way and a plane coming out this way, as well as going back behind the wall and on the board. That's how you visualize this system. Now, energy expands omnidirectionally and propagates itself, and gravity condenses itself omnidirectionally, intercoheringly. The slide rule of the tetrahedron, if I take the amplitude or the tip of this tetrahedron and I slide it over gently, it has the same volume as long as my amplitude doesn't change. Notice how in the triangle it's the same affair. If I gently move this triangle's apex over, it's the same volume. It doesn't lose volume. It doesn't lose volume no matter how far I move it. It just becomes a very, very thin triangle or a very, very thin tetrahedron. What's neat about that is then if you keep the source and the base right there, this tetrahedron, and you stretch it out to infinity, it's going to have the same volume. It'll never lose its volume. It's just going to change its surface area. And it means that whenever the tip gets to wherever it's going, or as the slide rule goes, you can move this whole line and it still stays equal volume. Go with Synergetics, knowledge of equal volume quantum modules. What happens then is really cool is that this end of the universe is connected to that end of the universe at the same time. That's what we have a big paradox about. What's also interesting is that the tetrahedron loses no volume during its transit phasing. Neither does a photon. The photon, when it leaves its source, loses no energy during its transit. During its coupling, couples in accord with Planck's constant and accorded with the resistance of the material being coupled with. I wonder if it's easier to understand my system with a 6-axis metric and knowing how the vector field creates a dynamic which is identical to the number patterns that physicists are finding in the nucleus of the atom. Without making up extra dimensions, only understanding how energy vectors self-stabilize themselves and showing how those number patterns develop so that we are creating basically the beginning of structure. And that's why I'm mentioning then in my other video, when we start understanding how to send exact frequencies down a particle accelerator, and we can coalesce them with correct amplitudes and frequency measures, interharmonizing themselves. That's how universe creates protons and neutrons and combinations of them, through frequency interference patterning. And I've written down those frequencies, right? And we'll have to fine-tune them like I said in my other video. But we've got to get our minds away from the stupid things that stupid people are trying to make us believe in. I studied a lot of psychology. Sometimes I think that, well, maybe it's easy to think that, oh, well, maybe I've got another life living somewhere else that's just much better than this one because there's multiple universes going on and they're all just as real as this one. Let's not try and deceive ourselves. When we do that, we misunderstand the basic things that are happening in our lives also, our social lives, our political lives, the governing structure, what the economy is. I've got lectures for us in the future which are going to explain how the governing structure, the economy developed, how individual humans can create a system where they have no war, no poverty, no pollution. I'll be explaining those in some other videos. You guys might do well if you're interested in these to download them and save them, because once I start speaking about things that the power structures do not appreciate, they could take all my videos off. I know what I'm talking about, ladies and gentlemen. Appreciate your time. Of course, in the interim, I'll be thinking about other things that I may have missed and that you may be interested in learning. Until then, pick yourself up a book of Synergetics by Buckminster Fuller so you can understand in those 1,500 pages how he says he's developed the theory of nuclear structure. As he says, if physicists want to understand how universe designed atoms and combinations of them in pure principle, all they need to do is study synergetics. He also says once again that in regards to this system, this may come to be identified as the unified field. And I believe I proved that with my field equations, right? How the masses are equating with the forces, as I showed in my other videos. See? He said this may come to be identified as the unified field, which as an operationally transformable complex is conceptualizable only in its equilibrious state. So once we add time, whoosh, frequency interference patterning, and an understanding of how structure occurs and how transformation of structure occurs, both by the models I've shown you and the formulas that I've shown you, shows how these different polyhedrons transform themselves and where energy is lost and gained. Folks, I hope you watch all my videos. I appreciate your time. Thank you very much.